All right, so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jim Jones, and I've been coming here for quite some time, and I've really appreciated Hilltop because of its diversity and the openness for different perspectives. It's really made a place for someone like me, so I really appreciate the warm place you've made for me here. And I've been teaching for a number of years, and I do my teaching through a program I call Kinship Cafe. We didn't change the name of the church. We're just kind of helping you see a little bit about what I do. And with that, I've had more of a gradual transition to focusing on Daoism, which fits very well with more of my naturalistic perspective that I come from. And so we'll touch on that a little bit today. And I really want to focus on just a key issue that's really helpful for both Daoism and naturalism as a way of introducing you to it. And we'll contrast it with some perspectives that you might be a little bit more familiar with. Okay, so we're going to talk about what does it mean to live a sacred life, and specifically from a Taoist perspective. And to begin with, we have to ask the question, well, what do we mean by sacred? Because I think we use this word a lot and we have a sense of like a feeling about it, but it might be kind of hard to describe what it actually is or what it means. So let's look at that here. From a linguistic perspective, it literally means to be set apart or separate from the profane. And profane just is a fancy word for saying common. So when you talk about profanity, you're actually just talking about what the common people talk like. It's kind of funny to think about the origins of some of these words. But so in this sense, from where this word originates in that Proto-Indo-European context, it has to do with this idea of being set apart or separate. But the concept of what we feel, the affective aspect of it, can be summed up maybe with some other words: respect, humility, awe, fear, joy, gratitude, something bigger than myself, a sense of connection, something pure, or maybe even just beyond words. So there's a way that we feel when we think about what is sacred or coming into sacred space. But it wasn't always something that was thought of as being set apart as a particular place or a particular time, people, or things. If we go back into more of a Paleolithic perspective, which is preserved in a number of more indigenous ways of looking at the world, this was much broader, and it had to do with life in general or even nature. So we kind of have two different paths that we can think about when we're thinking about sacred. One is going to be dealing with what we might think of as exclusive. So if something's set apart, there's a particular place that's considered sacred, and you have to have access to it. And so this is where this idea of control and conformity comes into. If we think about some of the old temples, the way they were structured is they would have gradations of sacredness as you came into it. The outer part might be open to everybody, but then as you came in, maybe it was only open to, let's say, members. And then as you got closer to the center, you had maybe only priests could be there. And then sometimes they'd have like a holy of the holies, and only the high priest could go in there. So there's this level of control in terms of who has access and how do you get there. So you can think about in modern churches, issues of denominations needing to have ordination, or the idea of baptism, or the idea of confirmation, that there's levels of understanding and commitment and a process you go through in order to gain access. You follow? Now, the concept with this is really focused on an idea of transcendence, that there is something beyond what we might think of as the merely physical. And it's those points of connection between that transcendence and the physical world that they would see as these maybe sacred places. And it could be things, it can be people, it can be time, like a Sabbath or something along those lines. So transcendence is the idea with that other world, right? That there's a distinction between a physical world and a spiritual world. And that becomes very important for understanding that first of the sacred paths. Now, the second one deals with the idea of immanence. And immanence is the idea that everything is imbued in the here and now, that there isn't a separate, there isn't a other world. So in naturalism, philosophical naturalism, it basically is the perspective that everything is the natural world. There is no supernatural. There's just the one. So with transcendence, you have more of a duality between a bifurcated world that's split in two And with immanence, or with the natural world, it's all one thing, or monism. Now with this, then, it becomes very expansive. It's not exclusive, it's everywhere. And it's very empowering in that sense because there is no controlled access to it. And it's also very diverse because it incorporates everything. There's nothing that is outside of it. So with naturalism and Daoism, it's going to be coming more from that second path. And even though I'm presenting this from a position that I'm passionate about, don't take this as an argument or a way to try and debate about this issue. This is more of an introduction to a conversation so that we can help to understand the different perspectives. If we visualize it, then we can think of transcendence as this idea that we're trying to gain entrance to, moving up steps. There's a path that we have to follow in order to be ready to have that access, versus immanence, which is going to be more like everywhere. And you wouldn't have a hierarchy in terms of like a priesthood. You may have people that function as leaders that can help people as guides in that process, but it's really democratized in the sense that nobody has ownership over it, nobody controls it, it's just everywhere. It's more about gaining awareness than it is about gaining a particular access. So my fascination with Daoism as a naturalist is it incorporates a lot of these ideas, and it comes out of a very interesting context. So this is ancient China during a period called the Warring States period. And during that time, the Zhou dynasty, which was the empire over all of China, had really started to devolve, and the different states were all fighting with each other over a span of several hundred years. And it's during this time that you have the rise of classical Chinese philosophy. This is where Confucius comes from, as well as Daoism. Those are the two main ones that continue to persist. But it was a whole bunch of schools that popped up at this time. And what was interesting is there was no official academy that could sanction or say that one is right and one is wrong. So you had a great variety of ideas that were allowed the space to really flourish. And it was in this context of social chaos where they're wanting to understand the question, how did we get here? How do we get out of it? Very rich philosophies came out of this, but it's very different than what was happening in the Western world. The Western world had much more, again, of the split dualistic world concept where there was a spiritual and there was a physical. But in China, it seemed to be missing that whole idea. So if we think about an East-West divide, technically India fits in the West in this context because it shares that divide between a physical and a spiritual world. But in China, that wasn't the case. And so we have very interesting philosophies that evolved that are very compatible with more of a naturalist view. And then the other thing that I find fascinating specifically about Daoism is they see this, some scholars, as a remembering of an earlier indigenous or Paleolithic worldview that's being brought to bear on the question of what's happening during the Warring States, about how to address the issues that are going on with that chaos. How did we get here? How did we get out? And there's a modern example of this that I can use. If you're old enough, you might remember a commercial that happened in the early 70s. And this was actually something that was quite moving to me and had a big impact on my life, which might sound strange thinking about a commercial that way. But if you're old enough, I think you'll remember. Anybody recognize this guy? So what was fascinating about this commercial is really more of a PSA, a public service announcement, is it starts off with this Indian in a canoe, and he's paddling down this river in the pristine forest, and it brings to mind everything we think about Native Americans and their connection with the nature and with the environment and how different their world was from our world. But then as he comes to shore, he looks down and sees a bunch of garbage, and you realize, oh, this isn't in the past, this is right now. And he's seeing like junk food wrappers, and he walks up on the hill and he sees the cityscape with all the smog and pollution happening, and he walks by the freeway and a car drives by and somebody throws a bag of trash out the window. And then he turns and looks at the camera. He has a little tear that comes down his eye, and the narrator says, "Some people have a deep, abiding respect for the natural beauty that once was this country, and some people don't. people start pollution, people can stop it. Just a powerful, powerful commercial. And evidently, it had a very profound impact on the level of pollution after they started running these ads. So it was very effective. So what you have here then is an indigenous worldview that's coming from more of that let's say, Paleolithic period of how they looked at the world and their connection to it, that's being brought into play to address a modern problem, in this case, pollution and how the world is being destroyed by using this different way of looking at it. The Tao Te Ching and Daoism in general in its early stages was essentially doing a similar type of a concept, taking an earlier way of looking at the world, our environment, how we're connected to it, and applying it to the question of how did we get in this state of this warring states period in ancient China. So now this, when I say religions of control versus indigenous, I'm not citing any specific religion, because this isn't really about trying to say one is good or bad or the other. And it's not control in the sense of like they're trying to do mind control, but it's more about regulation, or how they regulate access to whatever it is that they're offering. In this case, let's say the sacred or the holy. So the distinction we see between this transcendent view and the immanent view is going to be seen in a couple of different ways. We've talked about things being set apart versus the sacred being everywhere, but we also have regulated versus gaining awareness. So do we have to step through hoops to get there, or do we simply need to become more aware of our world and what's in it? The other is how the world is then looked at. If we are coming from a position of which there's an afterlife or another world, a spiritual realm, that's actually the preferred, and the physical is somehow just kind of a temporary thing, kind of a testing ground, if you will, on our way to that other world, then it tends to be viewed in terms of this context as more of a resource, something that can be used. So when the Indian is walking up on the hill and he sees what we've done with the land, that's because we're looking at it as a resource. We're not looking at it as a vital part of our context that we are a part of and that we live in. The other aspect then is where that focus is. Is the focus on where we go next, or is the focus on the here and now in this world and how we live? If you come from the perspective that this world is all there is and this life is all there is, you can't help but have a very different sense or orientation about life as you would if your whole focus is on where do I go next? What's after this? I'm going to skip the next one because that'll take me down a rabbit hole. So one of the things that we need to think about then is, how is a sacred view incorporated into our life? This will be talking about from, again, a Taoist perspective, but this is really used for any type of retraining of our minds or thinking about things differently. And the first thing that we have to recognize is that there's a way that we perceive the world. And Liz's quote that she read today is really illustrating that we have, from the Taoist perspective, a bit of a perception problem, because we tend to view the world in these negative terms. And the Taoists are saying, if we strip away the glasses, the filters that we've been given by our culture as a way of looking at the world, and we look at what actually is versus what we're told it is, it looks very different. And in fact, there's a lot to be offered that's very beautiful. So we start with this idea of perception, and how we perceive leads to how we feel. And this is crucial, because how we end up acting is based ultimately on our emotions. I used to think that it was all about becoming rational and how do we become more logical and make proper decisions. If you remember the old Star Trek, there was Kirk and there was Spock. And Kirk was the hothead that was always running around getting into trouble, and Spock was the logical one. And I always thought I needed to be like Spock. But then I come to see, as I'm learning about neuroscience, that for patients who have parts of the brain damage that allow them to have emotional responses so they don't have it anymore, they can reason through things, they can deliberate through different questions, but they can never get to making a decision. It's that emotional aspect that pushes you over the edge, that makes you make whatever decision you're going to make. So the emotional component is crucial. We can't bypass it. There's no way to get rid of it. Emotions aren't bad, they're very important. And those are going to be shaped by how we perceive our world. And again, How we feel then leads to what we do, how we actually act. So another way we can look at this same concept is, and I'm going to use just a very simple example here, of if I'm driving down the road and I get cut off by somebody, okay? Now, it seems like somebody cut me off and I'm like, honk the horn, or I get mad at them, or maybe I use some of that, what's the term that we use? Profanity, right? Common language. And it feels like something happened and I just had the response that was kind of one thing caused the other. But the more we think about it, we realize there's a feeling that's happening there, right? Something made me angry, which is then driving the action, which is honking the horn or chasing after them or whatever. And then if I go back even further, I realize, well, why am I getting angry? I've told myself some kind of story about who this person is and why they did what they did that's making me upset, that's then causing the action. So if we want to change the action, we have to kind of run this backwards. We have to think about, oh, I'm feeling something. I got this anger. Where did it come from? And we can take that back to looking at, how am I perceiving the situation? What is the story that I'm telling myself? And if we think that we want to change that story, we might ask ourselves a couple of other questions. What do I gain by using the story that I'm using? So I'm upset at this guy for cutting me off. I'm thinking either he's just being inconsiderate, or maybe he's not paying attention, maybe he's drunk, maybe he's just a jerk, and all those things are feeding into an emotional response. Well, that's going to bring about certain types of behavior on my side that might not be good. There might not be a lot that I can gain from that, other than, let's say, the gain is maybe a sense of righteousness, that I'm on the right side of this thing, or I know what's going on. I've made sense out of the situation. But we can also look at what we lose. So what do I lose in that situation? Well, if I get upset, if I get angry, my ability to focus on driving and moving down the road is going to be compromised. My brain is not going to be working as well. And what if I experience road rage and I start chasing after the guy? Then other people are potentially in danger. Or if I have somebody in the car, right? That's not good. So then I can ask myself, why am I so invested in this? I don't actually know anything about that other person. So why am I so convinced that it's this way versus some other way of looking at it? Which then opens up the door for me to ask, well, what if I tell myself a different story? My daughter has a friend named Vivian who gave an excellent example about this very thing. She said, when I see somebody cut me off on the street, I think, man, they must really have to go poo. And I think, oh, well, that's brilliant, right? Because if that's the story I tell myself, and I see the guy cutting me off, instead of using profanity, I might be saying, Godspeed, hurry up. I hope you make it, right? And now my whole perception is completely different. I'm not getting agitated. I'm still in control of my faculties. I'm driving safe. So there's a lot more that I can gain by telling myself a different story. And the reality is, I don't know anything about the reality of that guy, right? So what does it matter if I tell one story or another, if the result is that I am actually doing better, right? I'm more in control. I'm not losing my composure. So when we perceive and think about changing our story, there's a couple of ways we can go about this. One is more consciously. So if I'm in the situation with the car and I feel myself getting angry and I know I want to change my response to that, I'm going to have to start to get more of a conscious thought of when I'm feeling angry, pause and evaluate, why am I feeling angry right now? This is much more of a conscious way of going through this process. But as we do that multiple times, we create new neural pathways in our brain, and suddenly we don't have to think about it. It's just the default reaction. It becomes a habit. And habits then are changing who we are as people. If now when somebody cuts me off, I'm not getting angry, I'm just by default not letting it get to me, that's changed my character, right? And so this is a small thing, but we can think, if we take it to this bigger picture of looking at the distinction of how we're looking at the world from transcendence versus immanence, well, now there could be some really significant changes that happen. So to just kind of recap this then, our perception is shaping our habitual way of being in the world. It's shaping our character. Habits can seem like potentially a problem because they just happen automatically without thinking, but we actually need these things. Most of our going through our daily life is unconscious, and it's good that it is, because if we had to stop and think about everything, we'd never get anything done. If I had to think about how to drive the car, I'd be in trouble. We need to get to the point where things become habitual and they just happen almost like second nature, like instinct. So habits are a necessary shortcut for how we navigate our world. So if we think then about spiritual life, in a certain sense, we can say that it's all about shaping our habits. What are the habits that we're going to adopt to become what this spiritual person looks like, right? And again, we can think of the distinction between the transcendent and the immanent. And then ultimately, we could say that we are our habits. I think Guy's made this comment multiple times, and I definitely resonate with that when he brings that up. So, a key Taoist perspective then, when we're thinking about immanence, is that there is this idea of kinship with the world. And this is an important point here for us. Because in our Western world, we tend to have more of a separation, a divorce from nature. Well, how do we get there? One of the ways we can look at how we've ended up with this divorce from nature starts with this guy, Aristotle. And he had some different concerns about, what is the right thing to do? What is the wrong thing to do? How should we act in our lives? And he was working with a model that's virtue. And within that model, you have questions that you ask about how do we know if something is good or bad? If you take something easy, let's say like a knife, he would argue that there's a goal or an end or a purpose to things. And for a knife, that goal or purpose is to be able to cut. So if you cut well, you're a good knife. If you don't cut well, you're a bad knife. So then the question becomes for people, well, what's our end? What's our goal? What's our purpose? And he came to the conclusion that we are unique in our sense of reasoning, of our being able to make choices, to be able to be responsible for those actions. And so this would be where he's saying if we're going to be a good, virtuous person, we really need to develop these aspects of ourselves. The problem is that when we look at the world, we see that it is something that really functions more along the lines of cause and effect. Everything seems to be kind of driven by more of a mechanistic way of looking at things. So if humans are part of that, it becomes problematic because how could they be responsible for things, or how can they make these choices if everything's being caused by something else? So there was this thought that somehow people need to be free from that. They need to be different. And if we go to their world of being split between a spiritual and a physical world, the thought was that there must be something in the person. Maybe the body's physical, maybe the body is bound by cause and effect of the world, but maybe there's a spark or a soul or a spirit or something in the human that is of that transcendence world, of that spirit world that excludes them from this idea of cause and effect. The problem with that is we've then divorced ourselves from nature. We're somehow different than everything else. And whereas a lot of indigenous cultures and different worldviews would look to nature to understand how humans act and what humans are and how to be human, we can no longer do that because we're not part of that any longer. We've been divorced from it. So in contrast to that, the kinship with the world concept is that we are actually the same thing as everything else in the natural world. We're made out of the same stuff as trees and water and mountains and everything else. There's no distinction, there's no difference. We are not separate from the world. We're a part of or an aspect of the world. And this gets even more involved when we think about a concept of codependent origination. And what we're saying here is that we can't even be separated from our world. We need air. We need water, we need food, we need shelter. And to have any of these things, to have water, to have air, to have food, you need the entire universe because you have to have a planet that has the right types of chemical makeup and the right type of gravity, and you need the sun, and you can't have all these things exist without everything else in the universe existing. So how do we say that anything is actually separate? It's not that it's a bad way of looking at things to understand how to navigate our world, but it might not be the ultimate way to think about who we are. So it gets even a little stranger, because if we start to ask questions about what things are, we could start to say things like, well, how big are they? How small are they? How fast are they? But how do we answer those questions? If we want to know, is Jim tall? I don't know. Compared to what? You think that tall is an attribute of who I am, but it's not. It's a product of a relationship between myself and something else. If there was nothing else in the entire universe but myself, we couldn't say that I was tall or short or fat or skinny or any of the other things, right? How fast am I moving? Well, compared to what? In this room right now, it doesn't seem like I'm moving, but compared to the sun, I'm actually traveling very fast because we're orbiting around the sun, right? So everything, all the things that seem to make up the details of our world don't exist in the things themselves, but only in the relationship. There's a, and we can take this all the way down to that quantum level. There's a physicist that I really like. His name's Carlo Rovelli. And if you're at all curious about trying to get a handle on quantum world, he wrote this beautiful little book called Helgoland, and it's a very easy read. I just want to share a couple of quotes from that because I think it really gives a good idea of how this interrelatedness aspect works. First says, the discovery of quantum theory, I believe, is the discovery that the properties of any entity are nothing other than the way in which that entity influences others. It exists only through its interactions. Quantum theory is the theory of how things influence each other, and this is the best description of nature that we have. This is a radical leap. It is equivalent to saying that everything consists solely in the way in which it affects something else. When the electron does not interact with anything, it has no physical properties. It has no position. It has no velocity. So if you're at all familiar with some of these quantum weirdness that they talk about, how things don't seem to have a position or a definite velocity until you look at them or measure them, it's because they've stripped away every interaction of everything that could possibly interfere. And at that point, it's like there's nothing there until you measure it. But once you measure it, you're now interacting with it. And now it has properties. Everything to exist requires everything else. It's not simply that we're influenced by everything else and that we are dependent on everything else. We can't exist without everything else. The last one here says the properties of an object are the way, the properties of an object are the way in which it acts upon other objects. Reality is this web of interactions. Instead of seeing the physical world as a collection of objects with definite properties, quantum theory invites us to see the physical world as a net of relations. So when we think about this then, kinship with the world, how we are connected with it, it's everything, right? We are not separate from the world. We are a part of the world. Not only are we interdependent on everything else in our environment, but we exist only in relationship to everything else in our environment. That's that whole codependent origination. If that's the case, if we can really internalize this perception of the world, how is that then going to impact our feelings about the different things that we encounter in our world and how we go about doing our life? Go back to that perceive. We can think again about that Indian. What do we like about the first part of it when we see him canoeing down the river? We get this sense that they're connected, that they're not separate, that they had a way of thinking about the world back then that was very different than the way that we look at it, that somehow they were at home in the world instead of that spiritual song that says, "This world is not my home." Very different perspective. And that perspective leads to different feelings. How did they treat their environment? How did they treat the world around them versus how do we treat it? What have we done with the world? And that's, of course, going to lead to those actions. So this is a very high-level introduction to a core concept, in this case, kinship with the world, and how we think about what it means to live a sacred life from a Taoist perspective. Thank you.